Good morning and welcome to the second webinar in the Kitsap Salmon webinar series. Today's webinar is water quality in salmon. I would like to introduce Brian Stahl today. He is from the Kitsap Conservation District. It's super exciting to have him on today to let us know more about what they do there and how we can be more involved. So the floor is yours, Brian.
I guess to start with this, introduction. I'm the financial coordinator and also oversee all the planners for the conservation district. And I'm with the conservation district for going on 27 years. Prior to that, I used to own a dairy farm in Wisconsin. So when I first moved here, it was all agriculture, and that's all we did was pretty much farm planning. But we kind of branched out into several different areas, and that'll be shown on the presentation. Kitsap Conservation District. One of the things is we're big in, we plan everything that we do. We're big in education. We implement projects for stormwater and water quality. So we do that in several different programs. Mission statement: we are non-regulatory. So that's really important to us, and then also to our cooperators. We do a lot of educating by demonstration. If you ever want, please come to our office. We have water catchment, we have rain gardens, we have a lot of stuff, low impact development that we did purposely just to show folks what we can do and what they can do. Partnerships. I think we're unique in the fact that we get along with the health district, we get along with the county, WSU, and we're just blessed that we are able to work with all these partners, and we get a lot more done because of that, because we're not fighting. And I kind of mentioned ties into a demonstration. We dedicate ourselves to involving the community. Mission statement: landowner cooperation is huge. Interagency partnership, multi-funding sources that we get a fair amount of funding through Clean Water Kitsap, and that is your stormwater fee. We get some funding from federal grants, and then we have cost share and some technical assistance funding coming from the state, from Washington Conservation Commission. Like I mentioned earlier, for a lot of our projects, we will start with the design and we'll actually finish it up for you and assist you the whole way. Where do we work? Most of our work is in unincorporated Kitsap, and we do have interlocal agreements with Poulsbo, Bainbridge, Bremerton, and Port Orchard. A couple of the big ones that we've been going on. Bainbridge Island, we're fortunate that we've been working with them for, I think it's since 1999 or 2000, for a long time. And we just started this last year working with Bremerton on combined sewer disconnect project, because there was a concern just with the roof runoff going into the combined sewer system. So we have an interlocal agreement with them to disconnect that roof water and infiltrate it, or at least get it out of the sewer system. Funding, like I mentioned earlier, a good chunk of it comes through Clean Water Kitsap, and then the majority, I guess the rest come through multiple sources. And it's nice having a Clean Water Kitsap funding, because a lot of times you're looking for match that you can just leverage that money to get more funds. What do we do? So we have a farm program, like I mentioned earlier. That's something where when I first got here, I was a farmer, and that's what we did. Pretty much that was it. We just worked with small farms and trying to improve water quality, improve farm management practices, livestock management, and stuff like that. Then we got the rain garden program through Kitsap County. I guess the public works are at that point, it's Clean Water Kitsap, and we were very fortunate to kind of start taking over that stuff. And then, the most, I guess I'm gonna go kind of in order that things happen. Backyard habitat, that's another project, I guess, program that is through Clean Water Kitsap, and we work with landowners that have streams or wetlands to try to either remove invasive weeds, remove debris out of streams, help with, just get rid of fish ladders. This improves salmon habitat, and that's actually a grant program that I'll get into a little bit later. And then the last thing, the most recent thing is called GRACE, and I couldn't tell you I never remember what the GRACE stands for, but it's we put up this greenhouse a few years ago, and we've been using, and the whole point was to use Mission Creek women's prison crew as labor to operate this thing. And they did all this stuff for us, and it was wonderful, but then COVID hit, so now we have to do things internally and with volunteers. But all the food that we raise in there goes to food banks. And I think last year we had somewhere like about 16,000 pounds of food went to local food banks. We're really, really proud of that. The Green Stormwater Solutions is a rain garden program. You can see for the past 6 years how many practices we've installed per year. And on the right is that, what they are. I guess since 2010, we had rain gardens. We've installed 280 cisterns, 35, and so on. So it's a good program, and it's something where we're able to help fund it through the Clean Water Kitsap program. You can see we're taking this roof water and we're treating it. So the whole goal of the program ultimately was to disconnect those roof water systems, or the roof water and rain, I guess, the roofs from like the street ditches through stormwater systems, because once that water hits the ditch or it hits a stormwater system pipe, it's gone. And it goes right to the sound, where when we disconnect it, the goal is to infiltrate it either through rain gardens, through infiltration pits, pervious pavement, stuff like that. So we're infiltrating into the ground, which makes it cleaner. We're cleaning the water, and also we are, I guess, slowing down those flood events. Because everything's moving slower. The water still eventually it's, a good chunk of it's going to go down to the aquifer, but, also a lot of it hits the hard pan and then goes laterally, and then I guess recharges our stream. So this slows everything down, which is, really good for the environment, good for salmon, because we should in time see less flood events. And we have demonstration sites, so that every year we try to do at least one, if not two sites where it's a bigger project, and we'll actually put up signage, and so that people can kind of go to certain places and just take a look at some of our projects and why we do it. And we try to stick with the natives in the rain gardens. Just because they're native, they're supposed to be here, and they're going to do better with lower maintenance than if you start going with certain kinds of ornamentals and stuff like that. And on the right, that's it's a rain garden. That's a really beautiful one. I wish I knew who that was, but you see some ponding in there, and that's normal. Ideally, you want you don't want that ponding to last more than 2 days. If it lasts more than 2 days, then there's a problem, because then we're not infiltrating, and we're just creating ponds instead of infiltration systems. The next program was kind of our farm program, just like we started off with. And here's a couple, good photos of some pretty terrible places. They had problems, and our goal is to go in there and help solve these problems, to create firmer areas for the livestock, because this is not only unhealthy for the environment, it's unhealthy for livestock. Just their, the feet and legs take serious abuse this way. But you get stuff like this, and you get a rain event, and where does this water go? It goes downhill, goes into a ditch or a stream, and then we eventually gets into the sound, and then we have shellfish closures and all kinds of problems that we don't want. So here's a couple samples of what we can do. The one on the left is a heavy use area, which is kind of a paddock confinement area where we put down either gravel, or we do have a grid, call it VersaGrid, and creates a good firm dry surface for the animals so that they have someplace to stick around. And then we really promote through the farm planning process to keep those animals in this area and keep them off the pastures and grasses, because in winter, those grasses and those pastures, it's wet, it's saturated. Then the animals are tromping around out there, then we're compacting it, which decreases infiltration, increases runoff, and then we have issues going back into the stream. On the right, I have a waste storage structure. This is something that we fund also. This is a bigger project, but manure storage is a big deal. If we can keep it under cover, then it's going to be protected. We're not going to have any nutrient loss. We're not going to have any runoff, and people can actually compost this and with moving it through the bins and bring it back onto their fields, or even sell it to neighbors for gardening purposes. A couple other sites where we have before and after pictures. So obviously, on the right, that was a kind of a pretty unhealthy place for animals and for the environment. And I guess the result was what we call heavy use area protection, is you gravel it and create a good firm dry surface for the animals. Same thing on the bottom. This is two different samples of heavy use area protection. The program, like I mentioned earlier, we do farm planning. We try to get 20 farm plans a year. And a farm plan is kind of it's a snapshot of the farm, the property, what kind of soils they have, what kind of grasses, what kind of livestock, how everything's being managed, kind of identifies where there's concerns, natural resource concerns. And then we go into correcting those. We work with the landowner cooperatively. Like I mentioned earlier, we're non-regulatory. And then we would help the landowners with giving them options on how to correct that. And a fair amount of time we can actually help fund. If it's in a high priority area where we have shellfish issues, or we have we're working with the health district and there's a stream problem, then we try to get funding to actually help these landowners implement what we're trying to recommend. Last year we got $490,000 that went from cost share to landowners, and the majority of those, we can only do 50,000 at a crack for a landowner. So there's a bunch of landowners benefited. I think that we're pretty proud of that, and we get a lot of stuff done that we can actually get that money to the landowners to fix problems. The backyard habitat program. So you can see here we replace a culvert that was either undersized or wasn't functioning. But this is a program where we actually paid for this. This is probably a bigger one. This wasn't the backyard habitat grant. This is probably a fish. I'm going to goof up on the acronym, but a family fish forest practice program. Triple FP is what we call it, to help create this, remove this fish barrier. And we do I guess when it comes to the program, Corinne in our office does an incredible job of, walking the landowners through the grant process. And she actually takes care of all that stuff. and takes care of permits, the design, funding, the whole works. And then Jesse will come in afterwards and get all the planting done. So I mentioned earlier, salmon habitat restoration, that's a big part of this program. Your backyard habitat is kind of misleading because it's just more than just a backyard. I guess I should mention earlier, all our programs work with private property owners. Mentioned we replace culverts with bridges, install large woody debris, install gravel, remove invasives, plant native species, rescue the fish during construction periods. So they're all things that, you guys are probably all learning about through your classes. But it's just the whole package. We try to get the whole works done and assist the landowners as best we can. So last year, we had 25, Jesse did this. He had 25 planting projects, in Kitsap streams. It was 230,000, of grant funding went to landowners for 10 projects. Removed one fish passage barrier that opened up 3.5 miles of habitat. And the Clean Water Kitsap funds helped us secure an additional 650,000 for this year that we're currently in a process of trying to implement. So we always try to, like I mentioned earlier, it's just, the Clean Water Kitsap funds help a lot in just creating that leverage or creating that match to get bigger dollars for bigger projects. Mentioned earlier, removing debris. We see this in there, and it's just good to get that stuff out of the stream to try to create a more natural environment. And this is a big one that, when I started, I knew about this project and actually did work on, design and stuff. I bet this is 20 years ago. And so we finally got this thing funded through the Brian Abbott Fish Barrier Removal Board, Salmon Recovery Board. Multiple agencies working to get this done. And unfortunately, it couldn't happen this year just because there were just some permit issues. So we got the funding. So hopefully it's all going to get installed next year and can get everyone on the same page so we can get this thing banged out. But this has been an issue for many, many years. And here's kind of a schematic of what's actually going to happen. I'm not too very familiar with it because Corinne does such a great job at what she's doing that I just kind of stand back and let her do her thing. I just make sure the bills get paid. Some of the benefits, increased stream complexity. That's just always good. You want wood. And back in the day when I first started here, here's a tangent. We actually straightened streams out. The whole deal was in the USDA and Natural Resource Conservation Service, we were pulling wood out of the stream. We were making sure they were straight because we wanted that water gone. Not so much. Now we're going back and fixing the same ones that we straightened out years and years and years ago. When I say we, I guess I'm using it loosely because that was before my time. So increased riparian area. We want good vegetation along the stream so that your bugs and stuff can fall in there and then feed the fish, and have good riparian area. Your wood's going to fall. Your trees are going to grow up. They're going to die. They're going to tip over and they're going to fall in the stream, and that's all good stuff. All of our programs improve water quality. We can say that across the board. It's about what we do is, try to create, better quality water for the environment. It's the wood and everything that adds diversity to the stream, and it makes for happy salmon and happy orcas. Some of the numbers for backyard habitat is that we had in 2019, there were 15 projects that were planned, 30 projects that were maintained. 15.8 acres were either enhanced or restored. 1,150 feet of stream habitats were made accessible, and planted 7,253 plants were installed. It was a busy year, and a lot of that stuff is Jesse, and he gets it done, and he gets around, and that's one thing that we actually have a little nursery on site. so that we have a lot of plants here that we can buy cheap, as bare roots, and then we pot them, and then they go out to our project sites. So I guess, yeah, that was very fast. I'm not sure if I'm on time or if I'm way too fast, but many hands make light work. So we try to get as much stuff done as possible, and yeah, the more people that we can get involved, the better.
Does the Conservation District ever do tours of private properties to demonstrate what others have done?
Yes. Yeah, I guess a lot, like I mentioned earlier, our property, our office is a good spot just to do tours. And we have done tours at other, stream project sites. We have done tours on farms and stuff like that. Obviously, we want to get the landowner's permission, because we're non-regulatory. We want to make sure that that the landowner's interests are protected. But no, I guess we can definitely do bring people on sites if they want to see certain things.
How much water can you legally collect off your roof?
How much water you can collect? So this is a big, this is something that there's a big discussion about this. I think it was like 7-8 years ago. Some maybe correct me on that, but you can actually collect everything. If it's coming off your roof, you can collect it. You can see my background. We actually at the office here, you can collect it as long as you're using it on your property. That's my understanding. But currently at the office here, we have the bins that are behind me. They're 10,000 gallons a piece. So we have about 50,000 gallons at this point. We're going to add 2 more tanks probably by the end of the month to collect water off the office, and then also off of the greenhouse, and that the greenhouse is 30 by 96. And the goal is we actually use, during the winter months, we will use the water to flush our toilets. We plumbed everything so that we can do that. And then spring and summer, we have about 1.5 acres of cropland that we need to irrigate, because we're growing all those foods and that produce for the food banks. And we have a well, and we're concerned about how much we're drawing out of that well. So we want to minimize that, and the more water we can collect, the more that gets back into the ground. And we're I think collecting 70,000 gallons of water. That's going to make a difference on the flooding. So we're going to have that much less water just leaving the property, and then we're in control of it. So you can collect as much as you want.
Thank you, Brian. I also heard that the Kitsap Conservation District gives out rain barrels. Is
Yes.
there any rules or anything regarding who can get a rain barrel?
Anyone in unincorporated Kitsap County can get a rain barrel. We don't have any right now. We were supposed to get some in a couple weeks here, but we try to we allow 1 per landowner, and ideally that's just kind of a carrot in order to get us on your property, so we can talk about maybe a rain garden, talk about some kind of infiltration, so that we can get more people infiltrating and helping our groundwater and the slow water down.
Wonderful. And we have another question from Christina. Do you create native planting plans for interested landowners, even if it isn't part of a restoration project per se?
What was it? What kind of planting plan?
Do you create native planting plans?
Okay, all right. We do have a landscape architect on staff, and Jenny does a great job. It's just going to depend on availability. If it's something where we're busy and we have stream projects, or we have rain garden projects that we need design for, obviously she's gonna focus on that. And she also helps with the plantings, and the designs for stormwater ponds. And I guess that's something that wasn't mentioned, but Kitsap County is doing a tremendous job of converting their stormwater ponds from just like storage to more of infiltration. So they're trying to create these more natural ponds instead of having to go mow them all the time. They're replanting with natives so that they can be more sustainable, less maintenance. So she does a lot of stuff, working with the stormwater program to do that. But yes, we can do, we can help with native plans. It just depends on, the availability and how busy we are.
Thank you. Does KCD provide cost share for pasture grass seed?
We can. It's going to be a really, really low priority, because the cost share funding that we get comes through the Washington State Conservation Commission, and they have different pots. One of them is the shellfish pot, and that's the big one. And if our goal in our office is that if there's a project that's on a stream that is flowing to a shellfish closure area, so the shellfish is closed, so you can't harvest there, we want to fix that. We want to do something to try to improve the water quality going into that bay or that that drainage area. So that's priority. If that landowner happens to be in one of those streams and they had other stuff that they wanted to do, because we can do pasture management or pasture replanting. We can do, like, show pictures of manure storage. It might be a whole plan that they want that. So that's a really long answer to probably a not so easy question, but we can't. We could fund it, but if it's just as standalone, probably unlikely.
All right, thank you. Brian, do you have upcoming volunteer work parties shown on your website?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think we just had someone, I think it was just some inner emails going on, that yes, there are people that are interested in doing some volunteer work. And I know Jesse with planting and stuff, he probably wouldn't turn down anyone. So if they would just, if they would go to our website and, email in, we will hook them up with someone, to either help with the planting. It could be with stream planting. It could be helping with the gardening program with harvesting. So yes, I have a hard time believing that we wouldn't accept. I know we're accepting volunteers. I know we are. So it really depends on how many we can do at one time, just because of the distancing and stuff like that.
All right, so we have a few more questions. Here's one from Janet. I live on a hill where almost all neighbors have built concrete driveways. Mine is gravel and gets weedy a lot. Would permeable pavers be effective? Does it go directly down to Indian Bay, or it goes directly down to Indian Bay?
I guess there's a couple different kinds of low impact development that you could do for a driveway. It really depends on how steep it is. We do have VersaGrid, which is a recycled plastic grid type system that we've done for driveways. Some of the cost, we've cost shared this through our rain garden program. It's only up to $1,000, but it's better than a poke in the eye. That we'll work on a driveway, but it really depends on how steep it is. So that's for any kind of paver like that, your slope is going to be the biggest issue. And we're more than happy to come out. I guess none of our service, we don't charge for any of our services. That wasn't mentioned, but yeah, we don't. And if you have a question, just email us, and we will be more than happy to come out there and see what you have, and then see what your options are.
All right, Brian, I have one more question, and I think you may have just answered it, but this one's from Brendan. I'm a lakefront sloping with runoff to the lake. Is my property a candidate for the rain garden project?
Yes. I guess the only projects that we would have that we would turn away for rain garden programs is like if you're in a city. You know, if you're in a city, and let's say Bremerton, you know, Bremerton, we do have, you know, I guess funding there to help with low impact development as well as a combined sewer disconnect. But if you're outside city limits, and you're outside the shoreline, you know, we just do not like doing any kind of infiltration on shoreline projects. And I'm talking saltwater shoreline, specifically high bank, because of the potential of a slide. But if it's a lake, yeah, it's something that we would definitely be, you know, interested in seeing what they have.
So our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer McIntyre, and she is an assistant professor of aquatic toxicology at Washington State University. Her specialty is aquatic ecotoxicology of urban stormwater runoff. And I am very excited to have her here today. I'm sure many of you have read a lot of the amazing research that she and her team have been doing. So thank you, Jennifer, and the floor is yours.
Thanks for being here. And I'm excited to share with you an overview of the research that I do. So let's see, I want to start off with this important information. So the research that I'm going to share with you today spans at least a decade and is contributed to by not just myself at WSU, but other researchers at WSU, at NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and UW-Tacoma. And then many people have, organizations, institutions, et cetera, have supported this research, in particular, Region 10 of the US EPA. He's a very important supporter that allows us to do the research. So the goals of this research program are twofold. One is to understand how toxic stormwater can be to aquatic organisms. And the other part of it is to look at the possible solutions that are out there and how effective those might be at preventing that toxicity. So for many years, we've been, a lot of this work has focused on coho salmon, and some reasons for that are that they're a great sentinel for looking at impacts to stormwater because they're distributed very widely throughout lowland streams in particular. And lowland streams tend to be the basins in which we also do a lot of development. So if we're going to look at urban stormwater impacts, lowland streams is going to be, where a lot of those impacts are taking place if we're focused on the freshwater system. Coho salmon also, among our salmon species, spend quite a bit of their life in freshwater. Species like pink and chum pretty much hatch out and head right to the salt water, but coho are among fewer species that do spend quite a bit of time in freshwater. So they'll be vulnerable to impacts from stormwater runoff, mainly in freshwater, not to exclude impacts that can happen in saltwater, but they'll be more concentrated in the freshwater environment before they're flowing out into the Sound or into the Pacific. Okay, some species or some groups of coho salmon subpopulations are listed under the Endangered Species Act as well. So in addition to these things, there is this phenomenon that's been documented for over 20 years now. So this is what you're seeing here, hopefully you're seeing, is a video of a beautiful coho salmon that has recently come back from the ocean. It is in a freshwater stream. It's barely started to turn its spawning colors. It's in great physical condition, but something is very wrong here. And in fact, this fish is going to die. And what we started noticing about 20 years ago was this happening in urban creeks. And the reason that we noticed it actually was because of a restoration project, some of that unstraightening of the rivers that was taking place, restoring the physical habitat of the stream. And then there was monitoring afterwards to see, did the salmon come back and start using the habitat? And they did, but the coho that they were seeing after a rain event were behaving like this. And then they found large numbers that were dead after a rain event that were still full of eggs. And so that's sort of the most noticeable thing. It's not just that they're in pretty good condition, but they haven't spawned yet. So, here are just some more videos of symptomatic fish that we captured before they died. And invariably we'll find them, they haven't spawned yet. So this has probably been going on for much, much longer than 20 years. And it's the fact that we started picking up on it was because someone had been in the stream doing these restoration activities. Because otherwise we expect to find dead salmon in streams in the fall, right? We just don't necessarily open them up to see whether they had spawned or not. So we did document this in a paper that came out in 2011 across multiple urban streams, showing that there were very high rates of this pre-spawning mortality in Coho. You know, sometimes 100% of the run if it was a small enough run, but you know, definitely more than half of all the spawners coming back to that system were dying prematurely. We found this was recurrent in the same system year after year and also present in different systems. And just for reference, so I put that 60 to 90% mortality. For those of you not that familiar with salmon, the rate of fish dying before they get a chance to spawn in like just a normal forested ecosystem would be like 1% or less usually. So that's a very high rate of mortality that we're seeing. And this kind of fuzzy graph here was a modeling exercise to show, well, at different rates of this pre-spawn mortality, you know, what would happen at the population level? And the modeling suggests that it won't take very long for populations to become local populations to actually go extinct at the rates of mortality that we're seeing in these urban creeks. So why is this happening? Well, we have some pretty good ideas now, and it's all related to stormwater. So the fact is that what we're looking at here is an extreme example of what is not a forest. And because it isn't a forest, it can't act like that when it rains. So the crux of the matter is kind of the amount of runoff that just comes off of impervious surfaces. So when we build up our landscape with things like pavement and roofs, rainwater doesn't have anywhere to soak into the soil, and so it must run off. And when it does that, it picks up the contaminants that we've added to our system, either, you know, pulling them off of metals and things like that from things like guardrails and roofs, and also things that are coming out of our vehicles and getting on pavements, pesticides we're applying, and just so many things, right, end up now getting moved directly into some sort of water body, usually without any treatment taking place. This is an awesome video by Laura. Now I'm spacing on her last name. So she's a diver, and out in Puget Sound one day, she saw this dark column in the water. And she actually thought it was a physical structure, but when she got closer, realized it was stormwater runoff coming out of an outfall into Puget Sound, just looking like a physical column in the water. So she started visually documenting this so that people could start to understand, you know, the scope of the problem. So this is what it looks like when that water gets, when the stormwater runoff gets into, you know, streams or out into Puget Sound, for example. So what we're seeing are we're seeing like the fine particles and stuff that get washed into the water, but what we're not seeing are the chemicals that are also washed into the water, and that's the focus of my research. So in addition to that modeling exercise on, you know, how long would it take for populations to become extinct if we had these rates of mortality, researchers at Fish and Wildlife Service and at NOAA also did a land use analysis, and they looked at the rates of pre-spawn mortality that were happening in all sorts of basins around Puget Sound, and then related that to the land use in those basins. And what they found is those higher rates of pre-spawn mortality, which are associated with the red in the figure there, were most associated with not just urbanization generally or impervious surfaces generally, but specifically roads, and even more specifically busier roads. So the idea there being likely that it's something coming from vehicles, right? Hopefully whoever's doing lawn work out here isn't too loud for you guys. So as a result of this, we started actually testing stormwater runoff coming off of roads, so roadway runoff, and a lot of our research has collected runoff from this particular location, some of you will recognize, in Seattle. Just happened to be a convenient road where there was a downspout where we could actually collect the road runoff when it rained. And we started doing studies directly with adult coho salmon. Here's an example of what our setup would look like. Each of these PVC tubes contains one adult salmon. It's a nice way to keep them calm when you're doing an exposure, so they're not freaking out and hurting themselves. And on the right, you can see that stormwater runoff has some very dark coloration due to the particles that it's carrying. So what we found is that it would only take a few hours of this exposure to this road runoff before those fish were, so this one's just a control fish, just exposed to the well water. And then the one on the right is a fish that has been in that stormwater for a few hours, you know, and it's showing that loss of equilibrium that we see in those fish in the creek. And not very much longer after this fish would have died. So we see that this acute mortality happens for adult spawners. We see it in recently hatched alevin when they've finally hatched out of their eggshell or egg envelope. We also see it in juvenile salmon, and we know that they all die in a relatively short amount of time. We also have done dilutions of this road runoff because most creeks are not 100% road runoff, right? And we found that it takes a lot of clean water to make this road runoff not lethal to coho salmon. So what you're seeing in this picture is that when stormwater was just 2% of our mixture, and this is road runoff we collected from just 3 different storms that we happened to collect the runoff from. When we diluted it down so it's 98% clean water and just 2% stormwater, then we didn't see any mortality. But above that, we would see some or a lot of mortality, even and up at 25% stormwater, 75% clean water, all of the fish died. So a lot of dilution is required, and we have a little bit of an indication of, you know, urban creek water, how much of that has the same kind of amount of chemicals as we have in road runoff. And so that's where I have this number, you know, kind of 15%-ish, you know, very variable, but somewhere in that range is the equivalent of about, the urban creek water can be the equivalent of about 15% road runoff. And certainly that matches up with the fact that in urban creeks during rain events, when runoff is pouring in, we see this high mortality. So using the juveniles, because the adults, of course, only come back once a year and short window to work with them. So now we know that we can use juveniles, and we're able to track this phenomenon. So here's a time course of just surface swimming. So just a behavior that one of the behaviors we see as they start to get sick is that they start to come to the surface of the water and then they start swimming around. And so we're able to see that they go from normal behavior to surface swimming to continuous surface swimming. Then they start to lose equilibrium and then they start to die. So in this case, you know, mortality was happening at around 5 hours, about, 300 minutes. But as early as like 40 minutes, we're able to see behaviorally that they're starting to be affected and they're showing this surface swimming. And also from this study, importantly, we took fish at this continuous surface swimming stage, and it was hours and hours before they were going to die. And we transferred them to clean water, thinking that might, reverse the condition and they might be saved, but they weren't. So by the time they're showing this behavior, they're already destined to die. So it doesn't take very much exposure, and it also doesn't take a very long exposure depending on the concentration. This result looked at 3 different dilutions or 3 different concentrations of stormwater, and then we exposed them from just an hour and then transferred them to clean water for the rest of 24 hours, or we exposed them for up to 8 hours, the rest of it in clean water. And then there's also just the full 24 hours in stormwater, and I'm showing you the percent of the exposed fish that were dead, either during the time in runoff or at the end of the 24 hours. So for the lowest concentrations, you can see that in the 5% stormwater, exposures as long as 4 hours actually didn't result in any mortality by 24 hours. And in 11% stormwater, they were safe if it was only a 1 hour exposure, but anything longer than that, and we started to see mortality. And what's interesting here is that a lot of the mortality is triggered by shorter exposure events. So I have to move everybody's faces so I can see my own pictures here. Okay, here we go. All right, so here, this 25% stormwater, all of the fish had died if they were in it for 24 hours, but most of that mortality was triggered, was caused by actually just an 8-hour exposure. And most of that mortality was triggered by, oops, I went the wrong way, was triggered by just a 4-hour exposure. All right, most of the fish from a 4-hour exposure were dead by 24 hours. All right, so we know that these very brief exposures can cause delayed mortality. Some of the other things that we've learned are that there are these changes that take place in the fish's blood, osmoregulatory imbalance, and also, and much more importantly, we think is their blood gets thicker, so hemoconcentration is taking place. And we wanted to know why that was taking place, and I have a PhD student, Stephanie Blair, who's been working on this, and this is a picture of one of her little coho subjects. And what she's done here is injected a dye into the heart of these fish and allowed the heart to move that dye through the vascular system, right? Pumping it through all their blood vessels. And then she would rinse out the blood with just clean saline water. And in the picture here, you can see that their gills are kind of white. And that tells us that all of the actual blood has been flushed out of their vascular system. And then what she did was she froze and sectioned these fish, and now she can look that dye that she injected can fluoresce. All right, so now she can see where did that dye escape from the vascular system and get into the tissues of the fish, because we think that's what's happening with the hemoconcentration is that the blood is losing its water, right? The plasma of the blood is actually leaving the fish somehow, and we weren't exactly sure how. They could be peeing it out. It could be like leaking out of their gills. It could be leaking into their body. All right, so the picture I'm showing you here, hopefully you can tell that this little picture of the head of a fish is to give you an orientation for these fluorescent images. All right, so here we have the brain of the fish encircled in yellow, and then the nose area, the olfactory rosette is just another organ she was looking at. And in the control fish, you don't see any fluorescence, right? That bright color isn't present in the brain or the olfactory rosette, but in the fish that had been exposed to runoff, you can see that there's a lot of fluorescence in the brain and the olfactory rosette. And then what that tells us is that the plasma was leaking out of the vascular system into the tissue of the brain. And that's probably the most important there. Whatever's happening to their nose, that's a problem, but it's probably not what's causing mortality. All right, and so on the left here, we're seeing that, that difference in the fluorescence intensity, very obvious, and hematocrit is a measure of that, the thickness of the blood. So in the runoff exposed fish, much more of their blood sample is just cells instead of being diluted with plasma. All right, so something is going wrong with their vascular system, and that's sort of where we're at now with that research. But we don't see this effect in all of the salmon species. We've not tested absolutely everyone at this point, but we did start by testing Coho versus Chum because they come back to spawn at similar times, often overlapping. And we definitely saw that Chum appeared not to be affected by a stormwater runoff that collected multiple times and tested again and again, would kill the Coho every time. And we've also now tested this suite of species. So we've tested the juvenile Coho and steelhead and Chinook and sockeye, and also juvenile Chum. And we find that they have variable sensitivity. Nobody is quite as sensitive as the Coho, but steelhead were the next most sensitive, followed by Chinook. And then sockeye and Chum both showed no apparent sensitivity. And this extended beyond whether it killed them or not. It also extended to those blood parameters that we were studying. So this study looked at the behavior, whether the behaviors were changed, whether mortality was caused, and also whether those blood parameters that we know are affected by runoff were affected. And we found that there were no changes in the blood parameters as well. All right, so what then in the runoff is causing this effect? It's great to learn more about what's happening to the fish when they get sick and die, and we're looking forward to learning learning more about like sublethal impacts that are probably taking place in these other species that aren't as sensitive. You know, but we also want to start working on what is it about the runoff that's doing this. So here's my iceberg analogy. We measure a bunch of things in stormwater or in water samples in the environment that we're concerned about, things like metals, things that we know are coming out of plastics. We measure nutrients and pesticides, some hydrocarbons, but really there are thousands of chemicals in stormwater runoff. And some of these we don't even know what they are. We can tell that they're there because there are chemical techniques that we can use to show that there are chemicals present without necessarily knowing what they are. So some of them, we don't even know what they are. A lot of the ones that we know about, we don't really understand how toxic they are. And then the chemicals that we do measure more regularly don't appear to cause this effect in the coho. We've done experiments where we took, you know, a whole suite of metals and also hydrocarbons, you know, PAHs, things coming from oil, and made a mixture, and we're like, all right, let's see if this will trigger that pre-spawning mortality, and it didn't. Even when we bumped the metals up to like 10 times the concentrations that we typically see in stormwater. So those don't appear to be what's involved. But it does look like vehicles are a source of that pollution, right? Based on the land use analysis. So we started looking at, well, what are those batches of chemicals coming from vehicles? We have particles coming from tires, from exhaust, from brakes. And then we have all the things that leak out of our vehicles or that we push out of our vehicles, like windshield washer fluid. So we started looking at these pools of chemicals because each one of these is now also a complex mixture of chemicals. And one of the things that was done, this is led by the folks at UW-Tacoma, the analytical chemists in Ed Kalaje's group, is they looked at a bunch of these different sources of chemicals in two-road runoff and characterized the chemistry. And this is a non-target approach. You don't need to be able to identify the chemical to tell that it's there. So in this picture, we're seeing just a whole bunch of different chemicals, and we're seeing whether they're present or not. The blue is going to be not even present, red's going to be very abundant, and comparing those across these different vehicle sources of pollutants. All right, and so then we compared that to samples of water that were highway runoff that we know we're going to kill coho, and also from urban streams where coho mortality is also observed, right? And then do a fancy statistical analysis to see how these profiles all compare with each other. So what's very interesting is, well, first of all, at the top here, you can see that most of the vehicle sources are clumped together. Most of the highway runoff samples all clumped together, showing that they're chemically similar to each other. And the stream samples clumped together, showing that they're chemically similar to each other. But check this out, tire wear particles, so water that we put over tire wear particles and then tested the water, that ends up looking most similar to urban creek waters and then to highway runoff samples, right? It's the only one of those vehicle sources of pollution that clustered with the waters that we know that kill salmon. So this lets us know that probably there's something in tire wear particles that is able to trigger this acute mortality. So we started testing tire particles. This is some of my graduate students doing the hard job of making tire particles for experimentation. And we use, there's an electric planer being used here, but mostly we use this carbide disc on an angle grinder. And we take different tires and just make a mixture. We're not trying to understand this tire versus that tire versus that tire. We're just trying to understand tires broadly, right? So we make a mixture from unique tires. Most of them are used because they're free, and a couple of them we purchased new, ground them up and combine them in equal weights. That's what that looks like. And then to make a leachate, to leach the chemicals from those particles, we mix the particles in with these glass beads, cap it all up with filters, and pass water through there, all right? And create a water that now we test on salmon. So there are chemicals that literally just leach out of those particles. This is what happens in the environment, actually. All right, so we did 3 things with this. We wanted to know, would these chemicals coming out of tires be able to kill coho? Maybe they wouldn't, right? Would they would coho be uniquely sensitive, or would the chemicals that are coming out of tire particles kill any salmon? And then also that pathophysiology, those suite of blood parameters that are impacted, would that look the same? Would that look the same as it does for stormwater, right? So we're comparing the tire leachate, that chemical mixture, to the chemical mixture of stormwater, which we know contains chemicals coming from tires. All right, so to answer that first question, this is a dose response curve. So we're looking at different amounts of tire powder that we had, or when we made one concentration of tire powder in the water, and then we diluted it and tested that on adult and juvenile salmon. And we're looking at the proportion of survival. So with no tire powder in the water, all of the fish survive. And then the more concentrated the chemicals are, the lower the survival is, right? And it looks like it's very similar for the juveniles and for the adults. So yes, the tire leachate chemicals definitely were able to kill both juvenile and adult salmon. And these look like environmentally relevant ranges. So we chose this concentration here for the next set of studies. All right, so question number one, yes, can cause mortality. Are coho uniquely sensitive so that would look like the same response as stormwater? So here we have, again, those PVC tubes, each one's containing an adult salmon, but this time we have 2 coho and 2 chum in every tank. 2 of these have just well water, and 2 of them have that one concentration of the tire leachate that we know will kill the coho within 24 hours. Okay, so we expected 100% mortality there. And basically we wanted to then look at what happens with the chum. So we repeated this experiment 4 different times and saw the same thing every time, which is that yes, the coho all died in this 24-hour exposure. None of the chum did. So yes, coho are uniquely sensitive to this chemical mixture coming from tire particles. And then finally, that pathophysiology, this is a combination of all those blood parameters. And this principal component analysis is kind of complicated, but let me just point out the things that I want to share with you about this. The difference between clean water and the chemical mixture water shows up along this x-axis here, okay? So clearly showing that something is different about the blood parameters of fish that were exposed to stormwater or tire leachate compared to clean water. And then importantly, there was no difference between whether it was tire leachate or stormwater, right? So that's the black triangles and the black circles kind of all intermixed here together. And then finally, it was the same blood parameters that were driving the difference between clean water and chemical mixtures. So an increased hematocrit, decreased blood ions, and also decreased blood pH. All right, so this last part, I want to talk about some of the possible solutions. And first of all, I want to mention source control. I'm going to also talk about green infrastructure, but I think we can't do this without at least some source control. So related specifically to the issue of stormwater impacts to coho salmon, and knowing that it's something related to tire chemicals, we've been collaborating with UW-Tacoma to identify what that chemical is. And in fact, we think we have identified it. And this research has just been accepted for publication in Science. So very soon we will be able to share it with all of you. And related to this, then, we are in ongoing conversations with U.S. tire manufacturers, about, well, what we think we're talking about, whether this chemical that we've identified could possibly be replaced in tires. They're kind of more talking about, whether it could be something else. All right, so green infrastructure is the other thing that we've been looking into as far as solutions. We know that there's a variety of green infrastructures that are used to control stormwater, some of which are geared towards chemical treatment of that water. So permeable pavements, bioretention, rain garden type things are all things that are both things that we've studied in our group. So I will summarize this part just by saying that we know that bioretention can clean up the chemicals in runoff to the point where it doesn't kill coho salmon. And that's fantastic news. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand why that's happening and how to maximize that benefit. We've also been studying whether whether that holds true for other species as well that maybe don't have this acute mortality, but have sublethal responses to the chemicals in stormwater runoff. All right, and this experiment was much like the one that I showed you with the videos earlier, where we exposed the fish to either well water or to stormwater, and then we took them out and put them in this clean water to see, what was going on. So under the well water scenario, we're seeing normal, normal behaviors, responsive to touch, kind of, aversion to bright lights, because it's now dark o'clock when we're doing these experiments. Unfiltered stormwater runoff looks a lot like that other video I showed you. This fish is not particularly concerned with being touched and also can't stay upright and, ultimately died in this summarized in this paper that I've got at the bottom here. And then the same stormwater runoff that was instead put through a bioretention column, just containing sand and compost, looking much like our fish that was only exposed to well water. So yay. And we've been able to show this again and again with juvenile coho, with zebrafish or aquatic lab rat, with a variety of different organisms and different endpoints. But not many of these are really long-term assessments. And so, so we have a number of experiments that are ongoing. This one actually is finished. And it was looking at an installation of bioretention that was receiving real world inputs of stormwater. So it was situated in Seattle under the I-5 Ship Canal Bridge. So for 2 years, it received stormwater runoff whenever it rained. And we were testing, how would bioretention perform for those 2 years, and then comparing that to how it would perform if it had plants added to it and plants and fungi added to it. And what we found is that the plants were able to improve the hydraulic conductivity, which means that water can keep moving through and getting filtered rather than the system getting clogged and not getting treated and just overflowing. And then when there were fungi present, the fungi help retain moisture, which we know is important to keeping the microbes alive that are doing the degradation of some of the organic compounds. And we also found that when fungi were present, that there was less leaching of nutrients, which, we're adding compost to these systems. So there are nutrients that will come out when the water goes through, and less nutrients came out if we put fungi in with the bioretention, and also less metals. Another GSI that we've been studying is compost amended bioswales, which is a technique that WashDOT's been using. So I've got a picture here of a bioswale. And then if you imagine like a strip running down that thing, that's what we recreated in the lab in the other picture. And pretty much here, instead of water infiltrating through the soil, you're pretty much relying on it moving across the soil, getting a little bit of filtration and interacting with the plant matter. And we're still working on the results for this. Another study, this is Lane McGuire, who's a master's student with me. And she's been looking at how long will bioretention systems last. We've got this 2-year study, but in terms of the chemical performance and the toxicological performance, we're trying to pack 10 water years into 2 calendar years and try to get a picture of that longer term benefits that bioretention provides. And in addition to that, we want to know, well, how much bioretention do you really need? Right now, we use an 18-inch depth. Do we need that much? And there's going to be a relationship there between how deep it is and how long it lasts, and we're exploring that. Another student is looking at specifically PAHs in bacteria, which currently we don't have standards for in terms of how well bioretention can treat those things. And so she's looking at bioretention and then also looking at the addition of plants and fungi. And then the last thing I wanted to tell you about is a project that we're looking at different types of permeable pavements. So we're looking at permeable concrete and also permeable asphalt. And we're looking at those with and without the addition of carbon fibers, because the limitation to using permeable pavements in places with a lot of traffic is that they don't hold up as well. They're not as strong as normal pavements. So the addition of these carbon fibers, it does increase the compressive and tensile strength of these permeable pavements. But we want to know, whether these permeable pavements might contribute anything toxic to the effluent that goes through them. Do they alone provide any chemical treatment? And there is some evidence to suggest that they do. Do those carbon fibers make a difference in terms of how well these systems might be able to treat chemicals or prevent leaching that might be happening anyhow from the materials like the asphalt? And then looking at how they perform over time. All right, so my summary slide, a lot of details because obviously I went over a lot of stuff here. So let's just summarize it. We know that coho are dying prematurely at high rates in our urban creeks because of runoff that's coming, primarily runoff that's coming from our roads, we believe. We know that coho are the most sensitive of the Pacific salmon that we have been able to test so far, which is most of them. But that steelhead and chinook also show some vulnerabilities, and this suggests to us that there will be sublethal effects even in survivors in those species. We know that it takes very, very high amounts of dilution of road runoff before you don't see this acute mortality anymore. And yeah, so we know that multiple different life stages are also sensitive to the runoff. I didn't talk about this, but coho embryos, so if they're still inside their egg membrane, their chorion, they actually are protected from the acute lethal effect. We think that's what's happening anyhow, is that it's really it's likely that chemical that's causing that acute mortality cannot physically make it through the pores of the chorion. So they're protected until they hatch out. And so instead of showing a lethal response, coho embryos show some sublethal effects, which is similar to other developing fish that we've studied, including zebrafish and also Pacific herring. We have a paper just out on stormwater impacts to Pacific herring. All right, and then kind of finally, almost finally here, I already mentioned that the roads seem to be the source of this acute mortality toxicant mix. And then tires within that mixture of chemicals that can come from roads appear to be the source of the toxicity. So bioretention looks like it's a great tool for preventing toxicity from stormwater runoff, at least to coho salmon and the other species that we studied that I didn't explicitly talk about. But we sure need a lot more work before we can answer that question of what is it going to take? How much bioretention of what types do we have to use where in order to protect our ecosystems? All right, now I will take any questions we want to put out there. Okay, 11:25, this must be for me. Maybe you answer this later. I'm wondering whether adults exposed to runoff will recover. Okay, so I think I did answer that, which is that they don't. And as soon, oh yeah, I would take this opportunity to say a little bit more about that. So I told you that once they show that surface swimming behavior, that we know it's too late, right? They did not recover when we moved into clean water. What I didn't say though about the subsequent study where we put them in for 1 hour or 4 hours or 8 hours, is that almost all of the fish that later died, when they were transferred to clean water, they were not yet showing any symptoms at all. So we know that even well before they start showing that surface swimming activity, they are in fact destined to die. Sad but true. All right, Kaylee asks, what makes these coho salmon more susceptible? And we don't know. It's a very fascinating question for a toxicologist. It could be something as simple as an enzyme that is different in coho compared to other salmon species. An enzyme that either works to transform a chemical into something worse than it is, or that doesn't transform a bad chemical into a safe one. It could be as simple as that. We're not sure. Catherine, how is this research on the impact of runoff on salmon being used by decision makers? Great to hear you're talking with tire manufacturers. What about legislation? Okay, so a few things here. How are decision makers using it? Well, you'd have to ask some decision makers. But I think it is guiding the conversation. It appears to me that this information is being used to guide the conversation on chemicals that are getting into stormwater and how we treat stormwater, how much treatment we need to put on the landscape, and whether we can do source control. So it seems to be adding positively to that conversation. And related to the tire manufacturer question and legislation, I mean, I think unfortunately, there's quite a process that would ultimately have to take place for us to be able to legislate on this chemical that we've just identified. And you know, we're hoping that tire manufacturers will be interested in taking a voluntary step in the direction of source control, but that may not happen. All right, and then Sean, is the chemical of concern found in all tires? And should there be a concern for tire crumb found on sports fields? Yes and yes. Now, we have not tested all tires. So you know, I can't unequivocally say that it is found in all tires, but we do know that it is a transformation product of a chemical that appears to be in all tires, that it's a transformation product of a chemical that is intentionally added to tires. So that's kind of one of the interesting clincher things, is that this chemical that's the toxicant is not something that the manufacturers add to tires. It is a transformation product for something that they add to tires, right? They add this parent compound to tires to protect the tires from ozone. And then ozone attacks that chemical instead of the tire polymer. And it makes this, what ends up being a chemical that is very toxic to coho. So it wasn't intentionally added, but there it is nonetheless. And then concern for tire crumb found on sports fields. I think so. Obviously, coho are not humans, but we don't know how sensitive humans are to this particular chemical because it's a brand new, newly identified chemical. It's not been on anybody's radar. And we don't know yet the relative sensitivity of really any species to this particular chemical, even though we've tested stormwater for some species and even tire leachate for some species. The actual chemical that we're pointing the finger at has never been tested on anybody except coho yet. So that's one thing. And then for those of you who maybe heard about the electron dam on the Puyallup River, they had, I can't quite remember how this happened, but somehow they had artificial turf down there, and somehow a whole pile of the crumb rubber of this artificial turf, and I mean like tons, washed into the Puyallup River. So that again is, you know, a concern for aquatic animals instead of humans using these turf fields, but it's and then, you know, it's not a good idea from the toxicologist perspective. Oh, and there's another question here. Oh, Sean was saying, I was thinking about runoff from sports fields. Yes. So we're talking with some folks at King County about looking specifically at that question. A lot of sports fields don't drain directly to creeks, you know, in which case, you know, we think it's probably okay because we know, for example, that soil systems, at least sand compost mixtures, will capture that chemical. Jury's still out on how long it will capture it for, but you know, things look pretty good there. But there are some sports fields that do drain to creeks, and in that case, yeah, I'd be very concerned. Laura asks, I've heard of studies regarding death of coho and heavy metals in brake fluids. Brake fluid. Did you find any similar research on this, or has it now been narrowed down to the tire particles only? Yeah, so we're pretty confident about the tire particles only. You know, we did make those mixtures of metals and hydrocarbons from oil, and you know, didn't see any response in terms of this acute mortality from those mixtures. So it's looking pretty compelling. You know, I encourage you all, when our science paper comes out, to check it out and see how convinced you are that that we have found the culprit.